Hello students, this is Shomdatta Bhattacharya and I will be doing a lesson on Haroun and the Sea of Stories today. The main objectives of this lesson would be for you to understand and appreciate Salman Rushdie's novel Haroun and the Sea of Stories and to understand the disparate thematic meanings and the allegorical nature of this novel. Let's go to the summary of this particular novel. Haroun and the Sea of Stories begins with a young happy boy called Haroun who lives in this sad city which is so sad that it has forgotten its own name. Haroun's father, Rashid Khalifa, is a storyteller and he is a cheery man who cheers up men and women with his stories. When Haroun asks his father where he gets his stories from, Rashid tells Haroun that he gets his stories from the Sea of Stories, which is controlled by a tap, which is controlled by a water genie. Haroun of course does not believe him, but then suddenly one day tragedy strikes their home. Haroun's mother runs away with their neighbor Mr. Sengupta and Rashid loses the gift of gab and completely lapses into silence. What also happens is his subscription to the Sea of Stories suddenly stops. Now Haroun has to take a quest, an adventurous quest to the city of Kahani to defeat Khatam Shud and his men who are enemies of stories and bring back his father's life. In the process of this adventure, what also happens is that Haroun learns the necessity and the importance of stories. In this lesson, we'll go module wise, and the first module will deal with the author. Salman Rushdie is probably the most important and the most significant name of Indian writing in English. His fiction, including his path-breaking work Midnight's Children, which was published in 1981, are almost always located in the subcontinent of India. And using magic realism, he often deals with the history and the politics of this particular subcontinent. Rushdie was born on 19th June 1947 in the city of Mumbai in a Kashmiri Muslim family. His father, Anis Ahmed Rushdie, was a lawyer and a businessman, and his mother, Negin Bhatt, was a teacher. Rushdie, the young Rushdie, completed his school education in Mumbai and then went to the University of Cambridge to study history. When he made his debut into the world of literature as a novelist, it wasn't really a great debut. His first novel, Grimace, which was published in 1975, did not receive much acclaim in critical circles. It was only in 1981, when he published Midnight's Children, that he suddenly arrived in the world of literature. The novel that Rushdie describes is his attempt to reconnect with his Indian past and his heritage. And it won him the Booker Prize, the James Black Tate Memorial Prize, also the Booker of Bookers in 1993. The novel was a huge influence on Indian writers in English, and it is majorly canonized into syllabus of all kinds on Indian writing in English. Rushdie has followed his critical and commercial success with such novels as Shame, which was published in 1983, The Moor's Last Sigh, which was published in 1995, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, which was published in 1999, and Fury 2001, Shalimar the Clown 2005, and The Enchantress of Florence 2008. He has also authored numerous non-fiction pieces, essays, short stories, and children's literature, including the Haroun and the Sea of Stories, which was published in 1990. this particular novel, Haroun and the Sea of Stories, published in 1990, was written in a particular kind of a background. And this is a good time probably to talk about this kind of a scenario, because Salman Rushdie has very recently, in 2012, only in this month of September, has published his memoir, which is called Joseph Anton, which talks about this whole period that we are going to discuss. So what happened during the publication or during the writing, let's say, of Haroun and the Sea of Stories? It was in 1988 that Salman Rushdie got embroiled in an international level controversy when his novel The Satanic Verses was published. The Satanic Verses was considered to be a blasphemous novel by a certain section of Islamic scholars and clergy who thought it was anti-Islam. It was against the Prophet and against the Holy Quran. Due to this novel was banned in several countries, including India, and a fatwa was issued on his name by Ayatollah Khomeini, the spiritual leader of Iran. Widespread violence followed, and Rushdie had to go into hiding and was under complete police protection throughout. Joseph Anton also deals with this particular period when he was under constant police surveillance and was in hiding. His problems, his trauma, his troubles, all of those have a place in the memoir Joseph Anton. All around the world, the scholars and intellectuals, literary critics had a huge problem with this fatwa. To them, it meant the end of freedom of speech. To them, it looked like the writer cannot have free expression. It was argued by them that in a free society, in a free country, a writer should have the choice of expressing his concerns without worrying about any harm that might come to him due to that. Also following this violence and criticism, Rushdie went into this period of a writer's block, and it was only in 1990, 2 years later, that with Haroun and the Sea of Stories, he came out of this block. This novel, Haroun and the Sea of Stories, was also written for a particular kind of an audience. In this case, Zafar, Rushdie's young son, had complained that his father did not write enough stories for him. During this 2-year period, Rushdie was separated from his son and would miss him terribly, and so wrote this novel for his son. This novel is dedicated to Zafar, and in a way, it explains Rushdie's situation to Zafar. In other words, Haroun and the Sea of Stories is an allegory about censorship and the writer's response to it. We will talk about how Haroun and the Sea of Stories is actually an allegory. For that, we would need to know what is an allegory. Allegory is a literary device where characters and incidents in a narrative are used as representations or symbols of certain ideas. We can also say that an allegory is an extended metaphor where throughout the narrative, characters, events, their actions, all of these, they are connected to meanings outside the text. On its surface, Haroun and the Sea of Stories is a narrative full of magical creatures and fantastical tales. But once we read the novel carefully, keeping the background in mind, we would understand the deeper meanings hidden in the text. The names used for characters and places will take us to the deeper layers of meaning. The novel presents through Haroun's adventures and stories and journeys the city of or the land of Kahani, Kahani meaning story again, which is divided into two warring factions. One is called the Gup and one is called the Chup. the guppies and the chupwalas. When Haroun gets to know that the land of Gup, and I quote here, is bathed in endless sunshine, while over in Chup, it's always the middle of the night, we understand that the two factions stand for good and evil. This is a very usual symbol, to use light for good and dark for evil. The guppies are the custodians, guppies meaning people who like stories, people who like to talk, people who like to tell tales. The guppies are the custodians of the sea of stories, and they are warm, friendly people who encourage conversations and exchange of ideas. On the other hand are the chupwalas, who are always trying to poison the sea of stories. These are seen as sinister, dark people who are part of Khatam Shud's gang, and they do not encourage intelligent interactions and not even language. The allegorical nature of the narrative here is very clear. On the one side, there are people who would rather have intelligent exchange of ideas, and on the other side are perpetrators of silence. On the one side, there are storytellers, intellectuals, writers, and on the other side, there are those people who are part of the censorship machine, who are there to perpetrate silence. And the struggle between these two factions is eternal. The narrative does bring out the tension between silence and expression when we keep in mind the background of Rushdie's own biographical details. However, interestingly, Rushdie doesn't keep it this simple. Rushdie doesn't make it a world of black and white. He creates a world of grey shades. He makes it more complex than this. He complicates the narrative by not making any confirmed heroes or villains out of his characters. There are problems within the guppies as well as within the chupwalas. We get to know that the chupwalas are in constant perpetual darkness because it is the guppies who have taken away from them the moon, who do not give them access to the moonlight without even their consent. The allegorical meaning here is that a certain level of censorship probably is needed even in free societies. Also, the chupwalas aren't all drawn in the same shade. There are people like Mudra who are against Khatam Shud's plans and programs. There are also people who support the guppies and who, at the end of the story, when there is this war breaking out, who support the guppies. So in this way, what Rushdie does is he complicates his narrative and doesn't a world of warring between black and white. Haroun himself says at one point that silence had its own grace and beauty, and talking is ugly and graceless. Rushdie presents this allegory using the literary style of magic realism. What is magic realism? That's where we need to begin. Magic realism is a particular literary style where magic blends with reality. Now, one can ask, how does it happen? What happens in magic realism often is that supernatural events, fantastic creatures or animals, hybrid creatures, and mythological characters are put into very real settings. And interestingly, no explanation is given for this very unusual behavior, making the readers amazed at this technique. They are usually straightforward narratives, but what we understand is that there are again deeper layers of meanings hidden within the text. For instance, in Haroun and the Sea of Stories, there are many magical elements within the text itself. I began the summary of the story with the sentence that Haroun stays. Haroun is this young, happy boy who stays in this sad, sad city. This sad, sad city is a city which has even forgotten its own name. It is that sad. There are these factories in this city which manufacture sadness, package sadness, and even export sadness. Now, this does look like a fantastical element in the story. But does it point to anything real? Does it point to anything that we can connect to? Is there a hint here? Do these factories in this sad city remind us of mundane, derelict, industrial towns which we all may have seen here and there? The magical elements here might not be as unreal as we think them to be. They may be pointing our attention to things that are real. It is this magic realism that basically uncovers all the major themes of this novel. The importance of stories, censorship, the use of language for control, etc. This is a sentence out of the narrative itself, and this question is faced by Haroun and Rashid, and they are in a crisis when Haroun's mother runs away with the neighbor. Haroun at that point, in impotent rage, shouts out, "What is the use of stories that are not even real?" What he means is that probably all these silly stories which have nothing to do with facts, they are the ones which create problems. This question is answered in the following exchange between Haroun and Khatam Shud, and I quote here from the text. "But why do you hate stories so much?" Haroun blurted, feeling stunned. "Stories are fun." "The world, however, is not fun," Khatam Shud answered. "The world is for controlling." "Which world?" Haroun made himself ask. "Your world, my world, all worlds," came the reply. "They are all there to be ruled. And inside every single story, inside every single stream in the ocean, there lies a world that I cannot rule at all. And that is the reason why." Khatam Shud here tells us that he is scared of stories because stories cannot be ruled, stories cannot be tamed, stories are wild. Haroun's quest here is just not an adventure or just not a silly adventure of a young boy, but it deals with more than that. It is an attempt to give his father a new life, and in the process, it also takes us back to Rushdie's central theme that stories are not told only for entertainment. When a storyteller tells people stories, these stories also create the dignity, freedom, and identity of these people. The power of these stories is made clear towards the end, where Rashid's stories have the power to incite an uprising. The masses of the Valley of K have this uprising against the autocracy of Mr. Buttu. They, through this story, realize that there can be parallels drawn between Khatam Shud's rule and Khatam Shud's rule of silence and Mr. Buttu's autocracy. Thus, the novel suggests that we ignore and mock at stories at our own peril. "Switch on the darkness," screamed Khatam Shud. In the novel, the Chupwalas, we have already talked about how Kahani is divided into two zones, the Gup and the Chup. The Chupwalas are in perpetual darkness and they can only see in darkness. Light actually blinds them. This darkness is equated to silence. Khatam Shud attempts to silence the people and silence the whole world of Kahani. This is an allegory of the censor's attempt to silence all meaningful exchanges of ideas and rule the world through imposed silence. This is a sustained motif in the novel, and we can always connect it to Rushdie's own life. This motif of silence and the lack of freedom of expression is also a reflection of Rushdie's own life, as I have already said. His novel was banned, including in India, where he was from. There were threats against his life. Critics tried to silence him. In the novel, the land of Chup is portrayed as a land of silence, whereas the land of Gup is this land where expression is celebrated, stories are told, and conversations and exchanges of ideas are always at the top priority. The perils of censorship are revealed in the defeat of Chup. At the end of this novel, there is this fight between the Chupwalas and the Guppies, and Chupwalas are defeated in that war. What happens is, at the battlefield, pages of Gup, they fight together as one unit. How does this happen? The Guppies have always been people who have been talking and arguing and exchanging ideas between themselves, amongst themselves. And what happens here is that exchange of ideas, that culture of exchange of ideas, what it does is it breeds warm bonds of friendship between these people, and they trust and support each other. On the other hand, there are the Chupwalas who are so silent and who have never talked to each other, so that they do not trust each other. They cannot fight as one unit, and at the end we see that they fight like a disunited rabble. Freedom of speech breeds trust and sympathy. On the other hand, silence and lack of communication breeds mistrust, bad blood. That is the idea behind this whole notion of silence and expression. As we have already talked about, at the end of this novel, the climax is a war between the Guppies and the Chupwalas. And the war between them is a war for supremacy. Chup wants to silence all stories, make Kahani completely go silent. On the other hand, there are the Guppies or the Gupwalas who would rather celebrate stories, expression, freedom of talking, speaking, all of that. This struggle finally descends to the level of an armed struggle between the two territories within the moon of Kahani. And this is the allegorical setup of the novel, and this reflects the wars that we see around ourselves every day. What happens during this war is interesting. Rushdie, through his description of this war and through his description of these two warring parties, mocks at all such wars which have no meaning at all. While the narrative slowly builds up the impending war and the Guppies march towards the kingdom of Chup, the actual war itself is related as a kind of a buffoonery. The Guppies are led by Prince Bolo, who is love-stricken by Princess Batcheet. Students, notice the names here of Prince Bolo and Princess Batcheet. We need to keep that in mind. Now, Prince Bolo's verbosity and stupidity make people laugh. He is no war hero, but a very common person. So, even though he is a prince, Rushdie complicates the scenario by making him a verbose, stupid man. The commander of the army is a General Kitab, who is such a naive person that he cannot even keep the most secret war plans really secret. We have already talked about how Chup, the kingdom of Chup, is a place of darkness. And this darkness, what it breeds is a kind of freezing cold. The Chupwalas always wear little spherical nose warmers to keep themselves warm. And they go for war wearing their nose warmers. The guppies also wear red nose warmers to keep themselves warm. And this makes both the parties look really like circus clowns. It is when Rashid sees them together on the battlefield that he says that really this is beginning to look like a war between buffoons. This buffoonery is not just there for laughter. Rushdie keeps it in the narrative to actually look at the foolishness behind all the bloodletting and the war that we see all around us. With this, we wrap up the lesson on Haroun and the Sea of Stories, a novel by Salman Rushdie. Thank you, students.